In Chapter 5, Section 2, we're going to talk about the limits to population growth. Today's Think About It question says, what determines the carrying capacity of an environment for a particular species? Your textbook uses the species of hydrilla, which is an underwater plant, and is actually related to a plant that we're going to use later on in the year. This plant grows perfectly well in Asia, but in the United States, it actually grows out of control. So why does this species grow very well in one environment but grow out of control in another? So what are the factors that determine carrying capacity? Either acting separately or together, limiting factors determine the carrying capacity of an environment for a species. So what is a limiting factor? It is a factor that controls the growth of a population. So what is a limiting factor? It's any factor that controls the growth of a population. There are many different kinds, including competition, predation, parasitism and disease, unusual weather, and even natural disasters. All of these control the size of a population. These two will happen regardless of the density of your population. But these three do depend upon the population density on how they act on the size of the population. We're going to talk now about those that are density dependent. These are factors like competition, predation, herbivory, parasitism, disease, and even stress from overcrowding. These depend upon how many organisms there are in a certain area. Density-dependent limiting factors operate strongly only when population density reaches a certain level. Remember, population density is the number of organisms per unit area. These factors really don't affect small, scattered populations very much. The density-dependent limiting factors, again, that we've already talked about are competition, predation, herbivory, parasitism, disease, and stress from overcrowding. Competition can lower birth rates, increase death rates, or both. When a population becomes crowded, individuals must then compete for their resources. Some individuals obtain enough to survive and reproduce, but not all of them. Others may get enough just to live, and some may actually starve and die. Competition is a density-dependent limiting factor. The more individuals in an area, the sooner they're going to use up their resources. Often, space and food are related to one another. Many grazing animals compete for territories in which to breed and raise their offspring. Individuals that do not succeed in finding a territory find no mates and cannot breed. For example, a male wolf might fight each other for territory or access to mates. Competition actually can also occur between members of different species in their attempt to use similar or overlapping resources. This type of competition is a major force behind evolutionary change. The effects of predators on prey and the effects of herbivores on plants are two really important density-dependent population control. In this predator-prey relationship, it's actually showing the wolf and moose populations on Isle Royale over the years. Sometimes the moose population on Isle Royale actually grows large enough that the moose become easy prey for wolves. When wolves have plenty to eat, then you'll see that their population also is able to grow. As the wolf population is then allowed to grow, they begin to kill more moose, which then causes the moose population to lower. As the moose population drops, the wolves actually begin to starve, so their population size will begin to go down. And as the wolf population goes down, then you'll see that the moose population is allowed to rise again. And this is a cycle that will repeat. Herbivory actually can contribute to changes in a population numbers just in the same way. From a plant's perspective, herbivores are their predators. On parts of Isle Royale, the dense moose population can eat so much of a tree called a balsam fir that the population of these favorite food plants actually will also go down. When this happens, the moose can suffer from a lack of food. We also have to remember that in some situations, human activity actually limits populations. For example, some fishing fleets catch more and more fish every year, and this has actually raised the cod death rate so high that the birth rates actually cannot keep up. And as a result, their populations have been dropping. Scientists are actually starting to study the birth rates and the age structure of the cod to determine how many fish can be taken without actually threatening their survival, so being more sustainable. Parasite and disease are really important density depending factors. They can feed at the expense of their host, weaken them, and a lot of times will cause disease or death. For example, ticks are parasites that can actually cause a disease because of the bacteria they carry. Parasitism and disease are density dependent effects because the denser the host population, so the more organisms you have in a unit area, the more easily parasites can spread from one host to the other, and the same with disease. The more easily disease is spread from one organism to another. Back to our Isle Royale population, you're actually going to see that there was an outbreak of a disease. It was called CPV, canine parvovirus, and it was accidentally introduced to the island around 1980. It killed about 13 wolves on the island, and only 3 of the survivors were females. So that's going to cause a major problem with the number of organisms in the next generation. The removal of these wolves caused the moose population to skyrocket to 2,400. The densely packed moose then became infested with winter ticks that caused hair loss and weakness, thus not allowing them to be as strong to continue through the winter and to reproduce the next spring. Stress. Stress happens from overcrowding. Some species will actually fight amongst themselves if overcrowded. Too much fighting can cause high levels of stress, which can weaken the body's ability to resist disease. In some species, stress from overcrowding can cause females to neglect, kill, or even eat their own offspring. Stress from overcrowding definitely can lower birth rates, it can raise the death rates, or both. And it can also increase the rates of emigration, which remember is organisms leaving a population. So now we've talked about density dependent factors. Those were factors that act more strongly if your population size per unit area is big. Let's talk now about density independent limiting factors. These are factors that typically do not depend on the density of your population. A lot of times things like hurricanes, droughts, and floods, or even natural disasters such as wildfires can actually act upon the size of your population, but they don't really depend upon how many organisms are there. They occur no matter what. So density independent limiting factors affect all populations in similar ways, regardless of their size and density. After a severe drought, for example, you can have a great number of fish that are killed in a river. And in response to this factor, the population size may be growing fine and then crash. After the crash, the population may build up again quickly, or it may actually stay low for a very long period of time. Sometimes it's hard to tell if a density independent factor is acting really on its own. On Isle Royale, for example, the moose population grew exponentially for a time even after the wolf population crashed. But then the bitter cold with very heavy snowfall covered the plants that the moose feed on, making it difficult for the moose to move around and find food. Because this was actually an island population, emigration wasn't possible, so many of the moose weakened and died. In this case, the bad weather on a large, dense population actually caused a greater loss than what would have happened to a small population. Because in a small population, even with a bad winter, the moose would have had more food available because there would have been less competition. So sometimes density dependence and independence work together to limit population growth. The hydrillas that we talked about earlier in this section were an introduced species. They are an organism that is not native to the United States, but it was brought here from Asia. It does not have density-dependent population limiting factors to keep it under control. For example, where it lives, there are plant-eating insects or fishes that will survive and live off of the hydrillas. But here, we don't have those organisms, so it has runaway population growth. There are efforts at artificial density independent controls, such as herbicides and mechanical removal, but these are really only temporary and expensive. We have some organisms here in Missouri that were introduced called the zebra mussel. What they're causing is overgrowth, and because they then overgrow in our streams and in our rivers, they are actually causing the mussels that should naturally be there to die off. Because these zebra mussels overgrowth, they're taking up all of the food, all of the resources, and the mussels that are here naturally cannot survive. These are images of how those zebra mussels have overgrown, and on this picture they're actually covering a crayfish. They're causing other populations to also be crowded out. One of the ways they're figuring out to control the hydrilla is actually to bring in a fish called the grass carp. And a grass carp is also not native to the United States, so they only used sterilized grass carp for hydrilla control. Why do you think that is? So in this section, we have talked about limits to population growth. Some of the limits we talked about were competition, predation, herbivory, disease and parasites, as well as stress from overcrowding, and humans. These were all density-dependent factors. These were factors that limit population growth, usually because of the density of the population, the number of organisms per unit area. These factors that are listed here are actually occurring greater on a large population as opposed to a small one. We also discussed limits to population growth that were density independent. These are events like weather and natural disasters that are going to occur and are going to affect all populations the same way, regardless of their size.